Welcome to Sleeping Times. Did you know that the turkey we serve at Christmas was completely unknown in Europe 500 years ago? That the Romans celebrated winter banquets where slaves dined with their masters for a few days? That during the World Wars, families made Christmas pudding with carrots instead of dried fruits and called seasoned potatoes fake goose? That Japanese people reserve fried chicken months in advance for Christmas thanks to a marketing campaign from the 1970s? The food on our Christmas table carries centuries of history, invasions, discoveries, wars, migrations, technological innovations. Each dish has an extraordinary story of how it crossed oceans, survived fallen empires, and transformed until it reached your celebration. Today we're going to travel from the Roman banquets of Saturnalia to the digital tables of the 21st century, discovering what people really ate in ancient times and how we got here. If you want to learn history while you relax, subscribe now for stories like this every week. Oh, and don't forget to leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always incredible to see how our community is spread across the world. Now, how about turning off the lights, finding a comfortable position, and preparing yourself for a delicious journey through 2,000 years of celebrations, forgotten flavors, transformed traditions, and the surprising story of how Christmas food became what we know today. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself walking through the streets of ancient Rome in mid-December. The cold night air contrasts with the heat emanating from windows lit by oil lamps. It is Saturnalia, the festival celebrating the winter solstice, and the entire city is in celebration. The smell of wine heated with spices floats through the narrow alleys, mixed with the aroma of smoked meats roasting slowly over embers. Can you sense how, even without Christmas yet existing, the human need to celebrate with food on the darkest nights of the year was already rooted in our nature? In that Rome of the 1st and 2nd centuries of our era, wealthy families prepared banquets that lasted entire days. There was no turkey, no panettone, no sugary desserts as we know them today. Refined sugar was unknown in Europe. Honey was the only sweetener available, precious and expensive, reserved for special occasions. Roman tables bent under the weight of elaborate dishes, whole roasted piglets with aromatic herbs, geese stuffed with dates and walnuts, fish marinated in garum, that fermented sauce made from fish entrails that would seem inedible to us today, but which was the ketchup of the ancient world. Wealthy Romans didn't eat sitting down as we do. They reclined on couches called triclinia, supported by cushions, eating with their hands. Utensils as we know them would take centuries to become popular. Slaves constantly circulated, offering water perfumed with rose petals to clean their fingers between courses. The meal wasn't just about satisfying hunger, it was a spectacle, a demonstration of status, a form of art. Think about it. How many of our modern celebrations still carry that same need to impress through food? But not everyone in Rome lived in such opulence. In the insula, those precarious multi-story buildings where most of the population crowded together, the celebrations of Saturnalia were quite different. Poor families might manage a piece of salted pork, some olives, coarse wheat bread, and cheap wine cut with water. Yet there was joy. Tradition dictated that during Saturnalia, social roles would be reversed. Slaves could dine at the table with their masters, children received small gifts of clay or wood, and everyone wore the pileus, a conical felt hat that symbolized temporary freedom. The difference between rich and poor in ancient Rome wasn't just in the quantity of food, but in the variety and origin of ingredients. While commoners ate what grew locally, patricians displayed delicacies brought from every corner of the empire: oysters from Britain, figs from Syria, spices from India. Have you ever stopped to think that despite all our modern technology, we continue to use variety and exoticism in food as a symbol of prosperity? The Romans also had their desserts, though very different from ours. They prepared honey cakes with fresh cheese, raisins soaked in sweet wine, dates stuffed with walnuts and covered with hot honey. There was a special sweet called dulcia domestica, dried fruits cooked slowly with honey, wine and pepper, creating a dense and aromatic paste that was served in small portions. The concept of balancing sweet and savory, which we see today as a culinary innovation, already existed 2,000 years ago. But there was a disturbing aspect of these banquets that is rarely mentioned: the vomitorium. Contrary to popular myth, it wasn't a room for intentional vomiting, but rather a corridor exit from amphitheaters. However, it is true that some Roman diners at feasts lasting hours would induce vomiting to make room and continue eating. Sounds shocking, doesn't it? But reflect. Isn't our modern culture of excessive consumption at year-end celebrations a different version of the same excess, just stretched across weeks of festivities? The preparation of these meals was a Herculean task. Without refrigeration, everything had to be made the same day or preserved with salt, vinegar, or honey. Kitchen slaves woke before dawn to start lighting clay ovens, grinding spices in stone mortars, plucking birds, preparing pastes. Fire was controlled manually, fed constantly and carefully with firewood. There was no button to turn, no timer to adjust. Each dish was the result of hours of intense manual labor. Pork was already, in that era, the favorite protein for winter celebrations. This wasn't accidental. Pigs were traditionally slaughtered in late autumn, when cooler weather allowed the meat to be preserved longer. The process of transforming a whole animal into food for the following months involved the entire community. They produced sausages, salted hams, lard for cooking. Even the bones were boiled to make broth. Nothing was wasted. Compare that to our modern world. How many of us really know where the ham on our holiday table comes from? The beverages also had their ritual. Wine was considered sacred, a gift from Bacchus. But Romans rarely drank it pure. They mixed it with water, heated it with spices, sweetened it with honey. There was mulsum, wine mixed with honey, served as an aperitif. There was conditum paradoxum, a complex recipe that included wine, honey, pepper, bay leaves, saffron, and dates, all heated slowly until it formed an aromatic and comforting drink. It wasn't just about taste. Each spice had meaning, an attributed medicinal property, a story. It's fascinating to realize that many of the elements we associate with Christmas, family gatherings, abundance of food, gift-giving, the temporary suspension of social hierarchies, already existed in Saturnalia, centuries before the birth of Christ. When Christianity began to spread throughout the empire, it didn't erase these traditions. It absorbed them, transformed them, adapted them. The early church strategically positioned Christmas close to the winter solstice, knowing that people were already conditioned to celebrate at that time. The Romans believed that the Saturnalia banquets honored Saturn, the god of agriculture and abundance, and ensured good harvests in the year to come. There was a spiritual dimension to the feasting. It wasn't just carnal pleasure, but a ritual of gratitude and hope. They toasted the gods, made offerings at household altars before starting to eat, poured wine on the ground in libation. Food connected the human world to the divine. Imagine the noise of these banquets, animated voices echoing in rooms with high ceilings, the clinking of bronze and silver cups, loud and uninhibited laughter facilitated by wine, musicians playing lyres and flutes in a corner, the constant crackling of fire in the central brazier. There was warmth, there was light, there was life. all of this in direct contrast to the cold darkness outside. This was the primary function of winter celebrations, to create a pocket of comfort and joy at the darkest time of the year. But not everything was carefree joy. Rome, in those centuries, was in constant change. Wars, plagues, political instability, all of this affected what reached the table. A failed military campaign could interrupt trade routes, causing spice prices to skyrocket. A poor harvest meant bread was more expensive and scarce. Ordinary Romans lived with the constant awareness that abundance was fragile, temporary, something to be celebrated intensely because it might not be there the following year. And so, as the lamps flickered on the nights of Roman December, families of all classes found their ways to celebrate. The rich with their extravagant banquets, the poor with their modest but lovingly prepared meals, all shared the same fundamental human need, to gather together, to eat together, to create memories. But as the Roman Empire began its slow transformation, as a new religion spread through the provinces, these traditions would also begin to change. And when Christianity finally became the official religion of the empire, something curious happened to these winter festivals. They didn't disappear, but gained new meanings, new names, and eventually new flavors that would come from places the ancient Romans couldn't have even imagined existed. We now advance about 800 years in history, and the world has changed dramatically. The Western Roman Empire has fallen, fragmenting into dozens of smaller kingdoms. Christianity is no longer persecuted. It is the dominant force uniting Europe. And that ancient Saturnalia, it officially transformed into Christmas, the celebration of Christ's birth. But while the religious meaning changed, the need to celebrate with food remained deeply rooted. Imagine yourself now in a great medieval hall around the year 1200, with stone walls so thick they muffle the howling wind outside, and a monumental fireplace in the center, crackling and casting dancing shadows on the dark wooden ceiling beams. Medieval Christmas tables were, above all, a display of meat. Not just any meat, but the most impressive, the rarest, the most difficult to obtain. For the nobility, the whole roasted wild boar was the centerpiece, not the common domestic pig, but the wild boar, hunted in forests, dangerous and imposing. The animal was brought into the hall on a huge platter, often still with its head decorated with bay leaves and an apple in its mouth. Servants carried the creature in procession while musicians played, transforming the meal into theatre. Have you ever noticed how we still do this today? When we bring the roasted turkey to the table on Thanksgiving or Christmas. But the boar was only the beginning. Truly opulent tables included roasted swan. Yes, those elegant birds that glide gracefully across lakes. After roasting, the swan was dressed again in its own white feathers, creating the illusion that the bird was merely sleeping on the platter. It was more a symbol of status than gastronomic pleasure. Swan meat is notoriously tough and flavorless. There were also peacocks prepared in the same spectacular fashion, with their iridescent tail feathers spread like a fan behind the roasted body. Ask yourself, did food stop being nourishment and become primarily art and power? Medieval nobles ate with their hands, but with rigorous etiquette. They used only 3 fingers, thumb, index, and middle, as using all 5 fingers was considered crude, something for peasants. Personal knives existed, each person brought their own, but forks were practically non-existent in Europe until the 16th century. Bread had a special function. Thick, hard slices of bread from previous days served as edible plates, called trenchers. Meat was placed on this bread, which absorbed the juices and fats, and at the end of the meal, these soaked trenchers were given to the poor waiting at the castle gates. And what did these poor people eat, the peasants, who made up 90% of the medieval population? For them, meat was a rare luxury. Christmas might bring a piece of salted pork if they were lucky and had saved during the year. More common was a goose, cheaper than other meats and which many families raised, or rabbits, hunted on common lands before hunting laws became more restrictive. Most of the meal would consist of thick grain porridges, dark breads of rye or barley, turnips and cabbage, vegetables that resist winter cold. We can imagine the frustration, seeing smoke rising from the castle, smelling the aroma of roasting meats, knowing it was so close yet infinitely distant. The concept of fasting days and feast days dominated medieval life. The Catholic Church mandated fasting on more than 150 days a year. No meat, sometimes no dairy, only fish and vegetables. This made Christmas even more special. It was one of the few times eating meat was not only permitted but encouraged as a form of celebration. The 4 weeks of Advent before Christmas were preparatory fasting, making the explosion of flavors on December 25th even more intense. Isn't it similar to how many of us diet before year-end celebrations today, only to indulge at the holiday feast? Spices were beginning to arrive in medieval Europe through trade routes with the Middle East and Asia, but they were absurdly expensive, literally worth their weight in gold. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, nutmeg. These seasonings came from places so distant and mysterious that many Europeans believed they grew in the Garden of Eden. Using spices generously in Christmas food was, therefore, an unmistakable sign of extreme wealth. They prepared a hot wine called hippocras, simmered with cinnamon, ginger, and honey, which warmed the body and numbed the mind during long frozen nights. Medieval Christmas sweets were works of patience. There was frumenti, a special porridge made of cracked wheat, cooked slowly in milk with saffron, cinnamon, and sometimes almonds. It took hours of constant stirring over low heat. There was also the mince pie, which at that time really did contain minced meat, hence the name, mixed with dried fruits, spices, and fat. A combination that seems strange to us today, but made sense when sugar was rare and expensive, and mixing sweet with savory was practical. The recipe traveled through the centuries and reached the United States with colonists, eventually losing the meat but keeping the name. Preparation for medieval Christmas began weeks in advance. Pigs were slaughtered in November in a community event called pig killing, where neighbors helped each other and then divided the animal's parts. The meat was salted, smoked, transformed into sausages. Special Christmas beer was fermented in advance, stronger and more seasoned than common beer. Special breads were baked with Christian symbols pressed into the crust. Women spent days preparing cheeses, preserves, pickles. There was no simply going to the supermarket on the eve. The celebration depended on months of planning and hard work. But there were dangers in the medieval kitchen that we completely forget today. Without refrigeration, food poisoning was common and often fatal. Spoiled meat was disguised with strong spices, part of why seasonings were so valued. Open fire meant constant burns. Small children died falling into pots of boiling water. Smoke from firewood-filled houses causing chronic respiratory problems. Cooking wasn't the relaxing hobby it can be today. It was dangerous, dirty, and exhausting work, almost always relegated to women and the lowest-class servants. There was also an element of superstition in medieval Christmas food. Certain recipes were made not just to feed, but to protect. Special cakes were baked with Christian symbols to ward off evil spirits. The first slice of Christmas bread couldn't be cut, but had to be broken by hand to bring luck. Leftovers from the feast were buried in the fields to ensure good harvests. The act of eating was intertwined with magic, religion, and hope in a way our modern rational mentality hardly comprehends. Or do we still do this in different ways when we insist on eating lentils on New Year's Day for prosperity? The difference between city and countryside was also striking. In emerging medieval cities, Christmas markets began to appear, where one could buy special ingredients, dried fruits brought from the Mediterranean, salted fish, spiced breads. There was more variety, more options, more influences from different regions mixing together. In the countryside, people ate basically what they produced on their own lands, supplemented by what they hunted or gathered in communal forests. Mobility was minimal. Many peasants never traveled more than 20 kilometers from where they were born in their entire lives. Food was intensely local, seasonal, limited, and there were beverages beyond wine and beer. Mead, made from fermented honey, it was popular in Nordic regions, where bees were more abundant than grapes. Fermented apple cider warmed English winters. At bedtime, they prepared possets, hot drinks of curdled milk with wine or beer, sweetened with honey and seasoned with spices. They were considered comforting and medicinal, helping people sleep on icy nights when thick blankets and fire in the hearth weren't always enough to keep out the cold that penetrated through cracks in the stones. Monasteries played a special role in preserving recipes. Monk copyists not only preserved religious and classical texts, but also cookbooks and knowledge about herbs and spices. Monasteries often had the best gardens, orchards, and breweries. They produced cheeses, breads, beers, and superior liqueurs. At Christmas, it was tradition for monasteries to open their doors to feed the poor, one of the few social welfare networks that existed. These monks were, in many ways, the first chefs and sommeliers of medieval Europe, experimenting and refining techniques that would be passed down through generations. But even amid all this celebration, death lurked nearby. Life expectancy was low. Many didn't reach 40 years old. Disease, war, famine were constant companions. This gave Christmas celebrations an intensity that perhaps we've lost in our era of relative safety and abundance. Each Christmas could be the last. Each family gathering might not happen again. So they ate, drank, laughed, and gave thanks with an urgency that transcended mere pleasure. Food was life, literally, and celebrating it was celebrating survival for one more year in a brutal and merciless world. And so as the year 1200 gave way to 1300 and this to 1400, Christmas traditions solidified. The boar, the goose, the special breads, the hot wine, all of this became part of the cultural fabric of Europe. But the world was about to expand in ways no one could imagine. Navigators were beginning to look beyond the Mediterranean to the vast Atlantic Ocean. And when they finally crossed those dark and frightening waters, they would bring back ingredients that would completely transform not just Christmas food, but all European cuisine. Spices that no longer cost their weight in gold. New flavors coming from continents whose very existence they hadn't even suspected. The medieval table was about to meet the new world. It is the year 1492, and Christopher Columbus has just set foot on lands he believes to be the Indies, but which are actually Caribbean islands. He didn't find the spice route he was seeking, but unknowingly he initiated something much greater. The Columbian Exchange, the largest exchange of foods, plants, and animals between continents the world has ever seen. Over the next 150 years, ingredients completely unknown in Europe would begin arriving in the holds of ships, and the Christmas table would never be the same again. Imagine the astonishment of a European cook in 1550, holding for the first time a bright red tomato, a strangely shaped potato, or tasting the heat of chili pepper brought from the Americas. How would you react to encountering a food that no one in your family, throughout all of history, had ever tasted? The potato arrived in Europe from the Andes, where indigenous peoples had cultivated it for thousands of years at altitudes that would leave Europeans breathless. But its acceptance was slow and full of distrust. For decades, Europeans thought potatoes caused leprosy because they grew underground. and everything that came from the subsurface was considered impure or poisonous. The plant belonged to the nightshade family, many of which are truly toxic. Moreover, the potato was not mentioned in the Bible, so how could it be suitable food for Christians? It took almost 200 years before the potato was fully accepted in the European diet, but when it finally was, it transformed into a savior, hardy, nutritious, capable of feeding far more people per hectare than wheat or rye. The turkey arrived in Europe from the Americas around 1520, brought by Spanish conquistadors who found it domesticated by Mesoamerican peoples. But through a curious geographical confusion, the English called it turkey because they thought it came from Turkey, since Turkish merchants traded in it. In fact, the turkey is native to the Americas, especially Mexico and nearby regions. It was larger than a goose, had more succulent meat than swan or peacock, and was easier to raise than wild boars. In the following decades, turkey began appearing on the Christmas tables of English nobility, eventually becoming the central bird of Christmas in the Anglophone world. When English colonists arrived in North America in the 17th century, they found wild turkeys in abundance, closing a curious cycle, an American bird that went to Europe and returned to the Americas as a symbol of celebration. But the true revolution came with spices. For centuries, black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg came through Arab and Venetian intermediaries, passing through so many hands that they arrived in Europe, costing fortunes. When Vasco da Gama discovered the sea route to India around Africa in 1498, everything changed. Portuguese and later Dutch established direct trade routes. The price of spices plummeted. They didn't become cheap, but they stopped being accessible only to royalty. Merchants, doctors, lawyers, the emerging urban middle class could now season their Christmas meals with cinnamon and cloves. Think about it. When something exclusive becomes accessible, does it lose or gain value? Did the democratization of spices change their social meaning? Chocolate arrived from Mesoamerica, where the Maya and Aztecs consumed it as a bitter ceremonial beverage, mixed with peppers and considered food of the gods. The Spanish sweetened it with cane sugar, which they themselves had brought to the Americas, and kept the recipe secret for almost a century. When it finally leaked to the rest of Europe in the early 17th century, it caused a sensation. Hot chocolate became the fashionable drink among aristocracy, served in fine porcelain, sweetened generously, sometimes flavored with vanilla. Also, a new world discovery. At Christmas, the tradition of giving chocolates as gifts began, although in beverage form, not the solid bars we know today, which wouldn't be invented until the 19th century. Sugar also transformed Christmas. Before the Americas, sugar came in tiny, extremely expensive quantities from the Middle East. But the Portuguese and Spanish established sugarcane plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean, using enslaved African labor on an industrial and brutal scale. The price of sugar fell drastically over the 17th and 18th centuries. For the first time in history, ordinary people could sweeten their food. This revolutionized European confectionery. Lighter and sweeter cakes, decorated ginger cookies, crystallized fruits, candies. All of this became part of Christmas thanks to cheap sugar. But there's a dark side here that we need to acknowledge. Every spoonful of sugar on European Christmas tables came soaked in the suffering of millions of enslaved Africans. How do we balance the joy of celebration with the knowledge of this historical pain? Corn, squash, beans, tomato, bell pepper, vanilla, cocoa. Practically half of what we eat today came from the Americas. But the flow wasn't one-directional. Europeans brought to the New World wheat, rice, barley, cattle, pigs, chickens, horses. They also brought, unintentionally, devastating diseases that wiped out up to 90% of American indigenous populations in little more than a century. European Christmas tables became richer and more varied precisely at the moment when millions of people in the Americas were dying their societies collapsing, their own food traditions being erased or forcibly transformed. It's uncomfortable to think about while celebrating, but it's important. Every tradition has its complete history, and it's not always beautiful. In 16th century England, under the reign of Elizabeth I, Christmas began to gain some characteristics we would recognize today. Christmas pudding, dense, dark, full of dried fruits, soaked in alcohol, has its origins in this period. It started as a thick porridge called plum pottage, made with meat, dried fruits, breadcrumbs and spices. Over time, the meat was removed from the recipe, more sugar was added, and it transformed into the pudding we know. It was prepared on the Sunday before Advent, and each family member had to stir it 3 times clockwise, making a wish. Then it was steamed for hours, sometimes days, and stored to mature until Christmas. On the day of celebration, it was soaked in brandy, brought to the table in flames, a spectacle of light and heat on the darkest day of winter. Mince pies also evolved. The medieval mixture of meat, dried fruits, and spices gradually lost the meat, but gained more crystallized fruits, candied lemon, and orange peel. Citrus came from the Mediterranean and Middle East, becoming more accessible, and generous amounts of sugar. The shape changed too. They began making small individual pies in an oval shape, supposedly representing the manger of Christ. Tradition said you had to eat a mince pie on each of the 12 days of Christmas to have luck in the 12 months of the following year. These little pies traveled with English colonists to North America, becoming part of American Christmas and Thanksgiving. But not everything was exotic novelty. Many medieval traditions remained strong. The boar still reigned on English noble tables. Wassail, a hot drink of apple cider, spices, and roasted fruits, was carried in large bowls from door to door, with groups singing to wish health to neighbors who reciprocated with money or food. It was a form of wealth redistribution where the more affluent were socially obligated to share. When someone knocked on the door with the wassail bowl, refusing it was considered extremely rude and could bring bad luck. It's not different from the food collection campaigns we do today during the Christmas season, is it? In France, the bûche de Noël, the Yule log, had practical origins that became symbolic. Families would choose a large piece of wood on Christmas Eve, bless it, and place it in the fireplace to burn slowly throughout the celebration, ideally lasting the 12 days of Christmas. The ashes were kept as protection against lightning and bad luck. In the 19th century, when fireplaces were replaced by smaller stoves, especially in urban areas, the tradition transformed. Pastry chefs created a cake in the shape of a log, covered with chocolate cream that imitated tree bark, decorated with meringue mushrooms and sugar leaves. Food absorbed and preserved the tradition that technology had made obsolete. In Germany and Germanic regions, the Christstollen, a sweet bread filled with crystallized fruits, nuts, and spices, generously covered with powdered sugar, was already tradition since the 15th century. But it was in the 16th century that it gained its current form, elongated and curved, supposedly representing baby Jesus wrapped in cloth. It was so important that there were laws regulating who could make and sell it. The giant stollen of Dresden, presented annually to the local ruler, weighed up to 4 tons and required weeks of preparation. The Germans were also pioneers in making elaborate ginger cookies, Lebkuchen, decorated with icing and spices, precursors of the gingerbread houses that became icons of Christmas. In American colonies, Christmas was celebrated in various ways depending on who had colonized the region. In Spanish colonies of what is now the southern United States and Mexico, tamales were prepared for Christmas, a pre-Columbian Mesoamerican tradition that was adopted and adapted. In the English colonies of the North, Puritans of New England actually prohibited Christmas celebrations between 1659 and 1681, considering them pagan and excessive. Anyone caught celebrating was fined. But in the southern colonies, predominantly Anglican, elaborate parties continued, with tables laden with cured pork ham, locally hunted wild turkeys, coastal oysters, and imported puddings or local attempts to recreate recipes from the homeland. Coffee, coming from Ethiopia through the Arab world, began appearing in Europe in the 17th century. Coffee houses became social centres in London, Paris, Vienna. At Christmas, sweetened coffee flavoured with cinnamon or cardamom offered an alternative to wine and beer. It was seen as an intellectual beverage, one that stimulated conversation and clear thinking, unlike alcohol that dulled the mind. The enlightened elite drank coffee while discussing philosophy and science, even during Christmas celebrations. Two worlds coexisted, the traditional celebration of abundant food and drinks that led to happy intoxication, and this new culture of refined cafes and intellectualized conversations. But for the vast majority of people, peasants in Europe, slaves in the Americas, serfs in Russia, these exotic novelties were merely distant stories. Their Christmas remained what it had always been, a meal slightly better than normal, perhaps a piece of meat, white bread instead of dark, a small amount of something sweet. The distance between rich and poor, which always existed, was growing. The merchant class, enriched by global trade, had access to luxuries that were once exclusive to nobility, but the poor remained trapped in cycles of subsistence, excluded from the abundance flowing through ports and markets. Have you ever stopped to think if today, with all our apparent abundance, that inequality has really decreased or just changed form? As the 17th century gave way to the 18th and this to the 19th, the world continued shrinking. Faster ships, established trade routes, expanding colonial empires. All of this meant that ingredients that once took months to arrive now took weeks. Recipes traveled in letters in carefully copied notebooks through cooks who changed jobs carrying their knowledge with them. Christmas food was becoming truly global, a fusion of influences from all continents. But this globalization had an enormous human cost, paid mainly by those who would never participate in the banquets that their forced labor made possible. And while Europe and its American colonies developed increasingly elaborate traditions, another continent, Asia, had its own stories and encounters with these traditions coming from the West. We now travel to 19th century England, more specifically to the Victorian era, the period of Queen Victoria's reign between 1837 and 1901. It is here, in these transformative decades, that Christmas as we know it today truly takes shape. Imagine yourself walking through the streets of London in December 1850, gas-lit shop windows displaying Christmas products, street vendors offering roasted chestnuts, the smell of pine mixed with the aroma of hot pies. The Industrial Revolution had changed everything. The way people worked, where they lived, and crucially, what they ate. But did these changes make life better for everyone? Or did they just create new forms of inequality? The Industrial Revolution brought massive urbanization. Millions of people left the countryside and crowded into cities like London, Manchester, Birmingham. They worked in factories for 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Children as young as 7 operated dangerous machines. The conditions were brutal, wages miserable, housing overcrowded and unsanitary. For these working-class families, Christmas was a brief respite, one of the few days of the year when factories closed. With the little money they managed to save during the year, they tried to create a special meal, perhaps a small goose bought in monthly installments from a Christmas savings club that merchants organized. Roasted potatoes, bread sauce, a modest pudding. It wasn't luxury, but it was love materialized in food. Charles Dickens, the great Victorian writer, did more to romanticize Christmas than anyone else in history. His book, A Christmas Carol, published in 1843, painted an idealized but powerful portrait of the celebration. The Cratchit family, poor but united, preparing their humble Christmas goose with as much care as a nobleman would prepare his banquet. Tiny Tim, the sick but hopeful child, and Scrooge learning that the spirit of Christmas wasn't in abundance, but in generosity and human connection. The book was an instant phenomenon. People wept reading it. And something remarkable happened. Victorian employers, perhaps ashamed by the comparison to Scrooge, began giving turkeys to their employees at Christmas, closing earlier on Christmas Eve, showing small gestures of humanity that hadn't existed before. The Victorian middle-class Christmas table was impressive in its abundance and variety. The turkey had definitely replaced the goose as the preferred bird. It was larger, fed more people, and its price had fallen with larger-scale farming. But it wasn't just a simple roasted turkey, it was elaborately stuffed with chestnuts, sausages, herbs, bread, sometimes even oysters. It was served with bread sauce, cranberry sauce, a contribution from America that was returning to England, potatoes roasted in goose fat, Brussels sprouts with chestnuts, glazed carrots, mashed turnips. Presentation was everything. The table needed to look abundant, even if it meant the family economizing on everything else for weeks. The Victorian Christmas pudding was an event in itself. Prepared weeks in advance, in the last week of November, on Stir-Up Sunday, the specific Sunday when all families were supposed to start their puddings, it was a collective production. Each family member stirred the mixture 3 times, making a wish. Hidden inside the pudding were small objects. A coin meant wealth in the coming year. A thimble meant you would remain single. A ring meant imminent marriage. On Christmas Day, the pudding was turned out covered with brandy and brought to the table in blue flames, a moment of pure magic in the meal. Children watched with wide eyes, and even adults felt a thrill of wonder. Isn't it curious how we still seek these moments of spectacle in our celebrations today? But the Victorian era also saw the birth of something new and transformative: industrially processed food. The first food factories began producing items in mass that were previously made at home. Biscuits, which the British call biscuits and Americans call cookies, were manufactured on an industrial scale by companies like Huntley and Palmer's. They came in decorated tins that became collectible items, especially at Christmas. Chocolates. No longer just a beverage, but now in solid bars thanks to Van Houten's cocoa press invention in 1828 and Cadbury's milk chocolate in 1875, began being sold in elegant boxes as Christmas gifts. For the first time, you could buy beautiful, packaged, ready-to-give food. The concept of food as a gift exploded in the Victorian era. Christmas baskets containing fine teas, imported biscuits, crystallized fruits, small jars of jelly or preserves, port wines, all attractively packaged in straw and ribbons, became popular among the middle class as gifts for relatives, employees, or to demonstrate social status. There were entire catalogues dedicated to these products. Department stores like Harrods and Fortnum & Mason created special Christmas food sections. Shopping became part of the celebration, not just cooking. Modern Christmas consumerism, which many see as a 20th century phenomenon, actually has deep roots in the 19th century. Christmas trees, although of Germanic origin, were popularized in England by Queen Victoria and her German husband, Prince Albert. In 1848, an illustration of the royal family around a decorated Christmas tree was published in newspapers, and suddenly everyone wanted one. Trees were decorated with candles, dangerous, causing frequent fires, blown glass ornaments imported from Germany, paper chains, and crucially, candy. Sugar sticks in cane shape, still white, the red stripes came later, were hung on the branches. Crystallized fruits gleamed like jewels. Small mesh bags containing nuts and chocolates were tied with ribbons. The Christmas tree was, in part, an edible display. The Victorian working class had a more complex relationship with these emerging traditions. Yes, they wanted to participate, but the cost was prohibitive. An industry of seconds emerged. Smaller, or slightly damaged geese, sold cheaper at the last minute, imperfect fruits for puddings, lower quality ingredients. Butchers stayed open late on Christmas Eve, progressively lowering prices as the night advanced, knowing unsold meat would spoil. Poor families waited strategically, betting they would get a bargain, but risking ending up with nothing. It was a cruel game of economic survival disguised as festive preparation. Temperance, the movement against alcohol consumption, also marked Victorian Christmas. While celebrations traditionally involved generous drinking, social reformers began promoting a more sober and family-focused Christmas, centered on children and domesticity. Non-alcoholic beverages were promoted: alcohol-free punch, unfermented apple cider, hot chocolate. This tension between traditional celebration fueled by alcohol and the Victorian ideal of virtuous family created a two-faced Christmas: public and respectable versus private and indulgent. How many families today still navigate this same tension, trying to balance tradition with moderation? Christmas cards, invented in 1843, the same year as Dickens' A Christmas Carol, 1843 was truly the year modern Christmas was born, often showed tables laden with food, enormous turkeys, steaming puddings, fruits stacked in impossible pyramids. These images created aspiration, an ideal of what Christmas should be. But they also created anxiety and inadequacy for those who couldn't achieve this ideal. Victorian media, newspapers, illustrated magazines, cards, for the first time created a standardized image of the perfect Christmas that everyone was encouraged to imitate. Modern marketing was being born. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert brought German influences that enriched British Christmas: Stollen, Lebkuchen, ginger cookies, marzipan molded into festive shapes. But there was also influence from the British Empire: tea from Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and India, spices from all over Asia, dried fruits from Australia. The Christmas pudding contained ingredients from literally every continent, an edible manifestation of the reach of the British Empire. There was pride in this, a sense that British Christmas was cosmopolitan, sophisticated, superior. But there was also blindness to the human cost: exploited tea plantations, subjugated colonies, extracted wealth. In America, Christmas was developing in parallel but with its peculiarities. Thanksgiving, established as a national holiday in 1863, absorbed many traditions that in other places were associated with Christmas: the turkey, the cranberry, the massive family gathering. This left American Christmas free to develop with a slightly different character, more focused on gifts, on Santa Claus, a 19th century invention based on the Dutch St. Nicholas, and on sweets, candy canes, fudge, sugar cookies. The American separation between Thanksgiving, focused on food and family, and Christmas, focused on gifts and children, didn't exist in the same way in Europe, where Christmas had to carry both meanings. Technological innovations were transforming the Victorian kitchen. Coal-burning stoves with more temperature-controlled ovens replaced open fireplaces, allowing more consistent roasting. Mechanical beaters, operated by hand crank, made beating egg whites and light batters easier. Refrigerators didn't yet exist for home use, but ice was harvested in winter and stored in underground ice houses, allowing the making of ice creams and frozen desserts, a luxurious novelty at Victorian Christmas. Recipes became more precise with standardized measurements. Cookbooks were published en masse, democratizing culinary knowledge that had previously passed orally from generation to generation. But all this abundance and innovation coexisted with extreme poverty. Street children in London, described by Dickens and other social reformers, went hungry while shop windows displayed food they would never taste. Workhouses, institutions where the destitute worked in exchange for shelter and minimal food, offered Christmas meals marginally better than normal, but still miserable. There was growing awareness of this contradiction, leading to charitable efforts. Free soups for the poor at Christmas, food distribution by churches and charitable societies. But it was insufficient, a drop in the ocean of need. The uncomfortable question remained, is it possible to celebrate abundance ethically while others starve? As the 19th century ended, Christmas had transformed from a relatively minor religious holiday into a massive cultural phenomenon. Food was at the center of this, not just as sustenance, but as a symbol of family, generosity, tradition, and aspiration. The Victorians created many of the traditions we still follow: the turkey, the flaming pudding, the tree decorated with candy, the cards showing laden tables, the guilt of overeating followed by New Year's resolutions to do better. They also created Christmas anxiety, the pressure to create the perfect celebration, to impress, to keep up appearances. And as the world entered the 20th century, with its devastating wars, social revolutions, and accelerated technological innovations, these Victorian traditions would be tested, adapted, but fundamentally persist. Because in the end, humans have always needed light and warmth and shared food to face the darkness of winter. The 20th century arrived, bringing technological optimism, but also two devastating world wars that would radically transform people's relationship with food. Imagine yourself in England in December 1917, in the midst of the First World War. Enormous lines form before dawn outside bakeries and butcher shops. There is no turkey, no imported dried fruits, not enough sugar to make pudding. The merchant ships bringing food from the colonies are being sunk by German submarines in the Atlantic. Millions of young men, who should be working on farms, are in the trenches of France, dying in mud and poisonous gas. How would you celebrate Christmas when there is almost nothing to celebrate? Rationing. During the World Wars, forced desperate creativity. In the First World War, British families learned to make war puddings without eggs, with little fat, using grated carrots to sweeten in place of scarce sugar. The government distributed pamphlets with substitute recipes: potato cake instead of traditional cake, mock goose pie made with potatoes and onions, seasoned to vaguely imitate the taste of roasted bird. There was a government slogan: "Eat less bread, victory depends on it." Every slice saved freed wheat to feed soldiers on the front. Christmas stopped being about abundance and became about survival and patriotism. In Germany, the situation was even worse. The British naval blockade caused massive famine. The turnip winter of 1916-1917, when turnips were practically the only available food. German families ate turnip soup for breakfast, turnip bread for lunch, roasted turnip for dinner. At Christmas 1917, there was no stollen, no Lebkuchen, no meat. German children received a single piece of black bread as a Christmas gift. Hundreds of thousands died from malnutrition and related diseases. This raises a profound question. When basic survival is at risk, does celebrating in some way become even more important, or does it lose all meaning? The Second World War brought even more severe and prolonged rationing. In Great Britain, it began in January 1940 and surprisingly continued until 1954, 9 years after the war ended. Each person received a small booklet of coupons allowing tiny quantities: 4 ounces, 113 g of bacon or ham per week, 1 egg, 2 ounces, 56 g of butter, 2 ounces of tea. Sugar, meat, cheese, everything was severely limited. For Christmas, the government occasionally released extra rations, perhaps a bit more sugar, a can of preserved fruit. People planned the entire year saving coupons to have something minimally special on December 25th. War Christmas recipes were ingenious and sad at the same time. Mock turkey was rabbit, or even sausages formed into the shape of a bird and decorated. Christmas pudding was made with breadcrumbs grated carrot as sweetener, fat saved over months. There were no imported dried fruits, sultanas, raisins, candied peel, so they substituted with finely chopped carrots tinted with food coloring. The result fooled no one, but the ritual mattered. Keeping the tradition, even in degraded form, was an act of psychological resistance against the war that consumed everything. In the United States, rationing was less severe, but still significant. Sugar, butter, meat, coffee, all rationed. The government launched campaigns like Meatless Tuesdays and encouraged victory gardens, where families grew vegetables in yards, parks, even on urban rooftops. At Christmas 1943, American magazines published recipes for pies using molasses instead of sugar, chicken instead of turkey, which was directed to troops, gelatin desserts, cheap and stretching far, decorated festively. There was a conscious effort to keep morale high, even with limited resources, but there was also a vibrant and morally ambiguous black market. Those with money and connections could get extras, real butter, sugar, even quality meat, at exorbitant prices from unscrupulous sellers. At Christmas, this parallel economy flourished. Rich families still managed laden tables, while poor neighbors survived on rations. This created enormous social tensions. Was it fair? Was it food betrayal to feed your children with illegally purchased food while soldiers starved on the battlefield? The answers weren't simple, and many carried guilt for decades over choices made in those desperate years. Children who grew up during the wars carried permanent marks. Adults in 2025 who are in their 80s or 90s grew up with rationing, and many never managed to throw food away. They saved old bread, reused fat, made use of every scrap. Their Christmas tables, decades after the war, continued to reflect that trauma. Excessive abundance as compensation for years of scarcity, but also an inability to relax and enjoy without anxiety. Doesn't this remind us of our own collective traumas? The recent pandemic, for example, and how they shape our behaviors long after the danger passes. There were also innovations born from necessity. Canned and processed food, already existing but considered inferior, became accepted and even valued during the wars. Spam, canned meat, which American soldiers hated but ate daily, became a symbol of the war effort. Canned fruits and vegetables replaced fresh ones, powdered milk, dehydrated eggs, instant coffee, products that after the war would remain popular for convenience. The wars accelerated our transition from fresh, homemade food to processed and industrial. In Japan, things were different but equally difficult. Christmas wasn't a local tradition, but after World War II and American occupation, it began to be adopted curiously. In the 1950s-60s, a unique tradition emerged, eating fried chicken from KFC at Christmas, the result of a brilliant marketing campaign by the American chain in Japan. Japanese families, without their own Christmas traditions, embraced this as authentic American Christmas. Today, Japanese people order KFC months in advance for Christmas. It's a fascinating example of how traditions are invented and adopted, sometimes in completely commercial and artificial ways. In the post-revolutionary Soviet Union, religious Christmas was suppressed by the atheist communist regime, but food traditions were transferred to New Year. The Christmas tree became the New Year tree, and Ded Moroz, Grandfather Frost, equivalent to Santa Claus, brought gifts on December 31st. Food remained important: elaborate salads, caviar when possible, abundant vodka. Even under communism with frequent scarcity, people found ways to celebrate. Networks of favors and black market exchanges allowed access to special ingredients. It was risky, but important enough to be worth the risk. Archive Christmas photos from the 1940s-50s show families smiling around tables that, to modern eyes, seem modest. Small roasts, few side dishes, simple decorations. But those people were genuinely grateful. They had survived the war, lost friends and relatives, gone hungry. That simple food represented peace, reconstruction, hope that the worst had passed. Have we lost that capacity for deep gratitude when we have too much too easily? The transition from rationing back to abundance was gradual and uneven. In Great Britain, sweets came off rationing in 1953, causing runs on stores. Sugar was derationed in 1953, butter in 1954. Finally, for the first time in 14 years, people could make a true Christmas pudding with all the ingredients. There was celebration, but also disorientation. An entire generation had grown up without knowing abundance. Mothers who spent years improvising with substitutes suddenly had to relearn old forgotten recipes. In post-war America, abundance returned quickly and forcefully. The 1950s saw the explosion of consumer culture. Enormous supermarkets, refrigerators in every home, frozen food, instant meals. American Christmas became a spectacle of abundance, tables groaning under the weight of multiple dishes, desserts piled high, varied beverages. It was excessive, purposeful. After years of sacrifice, there was a collective need to prove it was over, that they had won, that they could have everything. But a discussion also began that persists to this day. Where is the line between celebration and waste? The scars of the wars remained in collective culinary memory. People continued using substitute recipes even when real ingredients were available. Because it worked, because it was what they knew, because it maintained connection to those difficult but formative years. Carrot cake, which emerged from substituting dried fruits with carrot during rationing, remained popular. Dishes of creative leftovers became traditions. The war had taught that food shouldn't be taken for granted, a lesson that the next generation, raised in abundance, often didn't understand. And as the world moved forward into the second half of the 20th century, new transformations awaited. Accelerated globalization, instant food, and eventually the digital age that would change even how we learn to cook. If you're enjoying this journey through the flavors and stories of Christmas through the centuries, give this video a like. Every like shows us that this content is resonating with you and motivates us to bring more fascinating stories. And if you haven't subscribed to Sleeping Times yet, now is the perfect time. We have many other historical journeys waiting for you. What period of history would you like to explore with us next? Leave your suggestion in the comments. Now let's continue our journey. We still have a long way to go. We now enter the 1960s and 1970s when the world experienced a transformation in how people bought and prepared food. Supermarkets, which began to emerge in the 1930s in the United States, now completely dominated the commercial landscape. Imagine yourself pushing a shopping cart down endless aisles in 1968, bright fluorescent lights illuminating shelves packed with products in colorful packaging. Ambient music plays softly as you choose among dozens of brands of each item. Everything is available year-round, regardless of season. It's convenient, it's modern, it's the future. But something was lost in this transition from the local market and neighborhood butcher to these cathedrals of consumption. Frozen food revolutionized Christmas. Swanson launched the TV dinner in 1953, and by the 1960s the idea had expanded. Complete frozen Christmas dinners that you simply heated in the oven, pre-seasoned and roasted turkey, instant mashed potatoes, frozen peas, gravy in a packet. In 90 minutes you had a traditional Christmas dinner without any of the days of preparation that previous generations required. For women who now worked outside the home in addition to being responsible for the household, this was liberating. But critics lamented, was it losing the soul of the celebration? Did replacing hard but loving work with industrial convenience fundamentally change the meaning of the meal? The 1960s-70s also saw the rise of gelatin as a symbol of culinary sophistication, especially in the United States. Gelatin salads with suspended fruits, decorative molds in layered colors, even savory dishes in aspic, meat jelly. Cooking magazines showed Christmas tables with shimmering towers of gelatin in impossible colors: lime green, neon orange, bright red. For the generation that grew up with rationing, gelatin represented modernity and abundance. It was cheap, went a long way, and looked impressive. Today we look at those archive photos with amused horror, but for those people, it was the height of elegance. What we find elegant today will seem equally ridiculous 50 years from now. Television profoundly changed how people learned to cook and what they expected from celebrations. Cooking shows began to appear: Julia Child on American PBS, Fanny Craddock on British BBC. For the first time, ordinary people watched chefs demonstrating techniques in real time. Christmas recipes became more ambitious, more gourmet. But this also created anxiety. If it looked so easy on TV, why did your attempt turn out disastrous? Constant comparison with what we saw on screens created unrealistic standards that haunt home cooks to this day. The Back to Nature movement of the 1970s brought a reaction against processed food. Hippies and environmentalists argued for organic food, grown locally, prepared from scratch. Books like Diet for a Small Planet questioned the environmental and ethical cost of industrial meat production. Some began making vegetarian Christmas dinners, unthinkable in previous generations, where meat was the definition of celebration. Food cooperatives emerged, farmers' markets, renewed interest in traditional recipes and unprocessed ingredients. It was a harbinger of debates that would intensify in the following decades about sustainability, animal ethics, and health. In Europe, the formation of the European Economic Community facilitated trade between countries. Ingredients that were once expensive imports became common: French wines on British tables, Italian cheeses in Germany, Spanish ham in France. European Christmas began to homogenize somewhat, with traditions mixing across open borders. But there was also resistance. Each country fiercely protected its traditions as part of national identity. The French would never adopt English pudding, the Germans maintained their stollen, the Italians their panettone and pandoro. In Japan, KFC consolidated its surreal dominance of Japanese Christmas. In 1974, the campaign Kurisumasu ni wa Kentucky, Kentucky for Christmas, transformed fried chicken into a national tradition. Families made reservations 2 months in advance. On Christmas Eves, lines stretched for blocks outside KFC stores. It's one of the purest examples of tradition manufactured by marketing, but no less real for those who practice it. Does tradition need antiquity to be valid, or can it be born in an advertising campaign and still have genuine meaning? Latin America developed its own hybrid traditions. In Mexico, the Christmas dinner, Noche Buena, centered on tamales, cod, hot fruit punch, and increasingly roasted turkey, growing American influence. In Venezuela, halacas, similar to tamales, prepared in large quantities, involving the entire family for days. In Brazil, tender, glazed ham, farofa, rice with raisins, chester, a bird developed specifically for the Brazilian market in the 1970s by Perdigão. Each country mixed European colonial influences with indigenous ingredients and local adaptations. Microwave ovens began appearing in American homes in the 1970s, promising revolutionary speed. Could you roast a turkey in a microwave? Technically yes, but the result was pale, rubbery, without that crispy golden crust. Some things technology couldn't replicate, but side dishes, mashed potatoes, vegetables, reheated leftovers, the microwave transformed. The day after Christmas became easier, turkey sandwiches reheated in seconds. Technology always promises to simplify, but sometimes the long process is part of the value, not just an obstacle to be eliminated. Christmas advertising became a cultural phenomenon in its own right. Nostalgic Coca-Cola commercials consolidated the modern image of Santa Claus, fat, bearded, in red, a design created by the company in the 1930s. Supermarket advertisements showed impossible tables of abundance. Children were bombarded with commercials for toys and candy. Christmas became increasingly commercial, and critical voices grew louder. Were we losing the true meaning? But what was the true meaning? Religious, family, commercial? Perhaps it has always been a complex mixture of all these elements. The concept of diet also infiltrated Christmas of this period. Women's magazines in December simultaneously brought indulgent dessert recipes and articles about how to lose the pounds gained during the holidays. This schizophrenic contradiction, celebrate with excess but feel guilty and compensate later, created an anxious relationship with food that defines many modern Christmas experiences. The joy of eating mixes with guilt, calorie counting, promises to start a diet in January. Is it possible to celebrate without this psychological baggage? In communist countries like the Soviet Union and China, official Christmas didn't exist, but people found ways. In the USSR, New Year absorbed all the traditions. In China, where Christmas wasn't a local tradition, it began appearing in coastal cities exposed to Western influences through trade. They were small cells of celebration in officially atheist systems. Food, shared secretly, prepared with scarce resources, became an act of silent cultural resistance. Food globalization was accelerating. Kiwis from New Zealand, mangoes from Brazil, spices from India, all available in Western supermarkets in winter at affordable prices. The concept of seasonal food began to lose meaning. You could have strawberries in December, squash in June. Was this wonderful progress or loss of connection with natural rhythms? Both. Convenience had hidden costs: carbon emissions from air transport, exploitation of agricultural workers in poor countries, homogenization of flavors. Restaurants began offering Christmas dinners for families without time, skill, or desire to cook. They could simply make a reservation and be served. This was seen by some as wonderfully liberating. Why spend days in the kitchen stressed when professionals could do better? Others saw it as sad abdication of family tradition. But perhaps the real question is, does tradition serve us, or do we serve tradition? If a family creates happy memories in a restaurant, is that less valid than memories around a home table? The 1970s ended with energy crisis, inflation, economic anxieties, but also with a more diverse and accessible table than any previous generation had known. Technology had transformed the kitchen, globalization had transformed the pantry, and as the world moved into the 1980s and 90s, new revolutions awaited: multiculturalism, growing environmental awareness, and eventually the internet that would put all the world's recipes at our fingertips. But these transformations would come with their own challenges and contradictions, as always happens when the new meets the old. The 1980s and 1990s brought a dizzying acceleration of globalization. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union, China's economic opening, the expansion of the European Union, all of this broke down barriers that had existed for decades. And with these geopolitical changes came profound changes in what we ate at Christmas. Imagine yourself in 1995 walking into a supermarket where an entire section is dedicated to ethnic foods: Thai sauces, authentic Italian pasta, Indian spices, ready-to-eat sushi. This was unthinkable just 20 years before. The Christmas table was becoming truly cosmopolitan, but did this mean cultural enrichment or loss of identity? Massive immigration transformed Christmas celebrations in the Americas and Europe. Vietnamese families in the United States prepared phi cho alongside turkey. Indians in the United Kingdom served lamb curry with Yorkshire pudding. Mexicans mixed tamales with American glazed ham. It was no longer one or the other, it was both. It was fusion. It was new hybrid identity. Second and third generations of immigrants created unique traditions that honored their roots while embracing the new country. This created tensions, grandparents lamenting lost traditions, grandchildren rolling their eyes at old-fashioned customs, but also unprecedented cultural wealth. Sushi became a global phenomenon in the 1980s-90s, something absolutely unimaginable decades before. Raw fish? For most Westerners, it was repulsive, but through emigrated Japanese growing curiosity and a touch of prestige associated with Japanese cuisine, sushi conquered the world. In some progressive American and European families, salmon sushi began appearing as an appetizer at Christmas dinners in the 1990s, an addition that would have shocked previous generations. What does this tell us about how cultural barriers can be crossed through food? CNN and other 24-hour news networks, along with cable television, brought the entire world into living rooms. Cooking shows multiplied, not just demonstrations, but competitions, culinary travel, food documentaries. Chefs became celebrities. Emeril Lagasse, Nigella Lawson, Jamie Oliver, names known in millions of homes. Their Christmas recipes were tried by enthusiastic viewers. Celebration food became more ambitious, more international, more Instagrammable, although Instagram didn't yet exist. But also more stressful, the pressure to impress had increased exponentially. Environmental awareness began to influence food choices. The slow food movement, founded in Italy in 1986 as a reaction to McDonald's, promoted local ingredients, careful preparation, conscious pleasure. Farmers' markets re-emerged in cities. Organic certifications became common. Some families began to question, should we serve lamb from New Zealand when there is local lamb? Does imported pineapple in December make ecological sense? Could Christmas be a celebration of local abundance instead of global exoticism? But the reality is that most people didn't think much about it. The 1990s were a time of economic optimism, especially in the United States. The Cold War had ended, the economy was growing, technology promised to solve all problems. Christmas tables reflected this confidence, large, varied, abundant, without guilt. Imported shrimp, wines from all continents, elaborate desserts. It was a decade of celebrated, unquestioned excess. Wall Street was booming, and that translated into laden tables. The internet arrived in homes in the 1990s, timid still, but transformative. Suddenly you no longer depended on family recipe books or magazines. You could access recipes from anywhere in the world. A website called allrecipes.com, launched in 1997, allowed ordinary people to share recipes. It was democratization of culinary knowledge on a scale never seen. Wanted to make authentic Spanish paella? Instructions were a few clicks away, but the problem of too much information also began. 10,000 Christmas pudding recipes, which to choose. Processed food reached its peak of dubious sophistication. Lunchables, Hot Pockets, pizza rolls, maximum convenience, minimum nutrition. Some families served practically everything from boxes and cans at Christmas without any stigma. Others reacted to the extreme opposite, making absolutely everything from scratch as a statement against industrialization. The middle class divided between these poles. There was no longer a single, traditional Christmas. There were dozens of versions, each claiming authenticity. In post-apartheid South Africa, December Christmas happened in summer. Outdoor barbecue, braai, with boera wars, sausage, fresh salads, and increasingly, influences from all cultures of the Rainbow Nation. South African Indians brought their spices, English, their nostalgia for pudding, in full heat. Africans, their meat grilling techniques. It was a microcosm of how celebrations evolve in multicultural societies. What is authentic when 10 different cultures converge? In Brazil, the 1980s-90s solidified traditions that today seem ancient but are relatively recent. Christmas turkey is not Portuguese traditional. It was culturally imported from the United States in the 20th century. Chester, that genetically developed bird, became so common that Brazilians assume it's an old tradition. Farofa, toasted cassava flour, on the Christmas table is a unique indigenous contribution. Each dish has a complex history of mixed origins, but they're experienced as simply what we've always done. The 1990s also saw the boom of supplements and healthy foods, protein bars, meal replacement shakes, low-fat products. The food industry responded by creating healthy versions of traditional foods, skinless turkey, desserts with artificial sweeteners, light Christmas recipes. But often removing fat meant adding sugar to compensate for flavor, or vice versa. The obsession with health didn't always result in truly healthier choices, just different anxieties. Ethnic restaurants multiplied in Western cities: Thai, Vietnamese, Ethiopian, Peruvian. Cuisines, once completely unknown, became accessible. Some began making alternative Christmas dinners: Peking duck instead of turkey, dim sum as appetizers, green tea desserts. It was experimentation, rejection of the traditional, pursuit of novelty. For some it was exciting, for others, disturbing. Older generations especially felt that something essential was lost when you completely substituted recipes that connected you to grandparents and great-grandparents. Satellite and later cable television brought entire channels dedicated to food: Food Network in the USA, Good Food Channel in the United Kingdom. Special Christmas programs showed dinners from different countries, techniques from renowned chefs, Christmas baking competitions. It was entertainment, but also education. Children growing up in the 1990s were exposed to far more culinary diversity than their parents ever were. This expanded horizons, but also disconnected from the oral transmission of family recipes that had been the norm for millennia. The phenomenon of Christmas brunch emerged especially in urban Anglophone cultures. Instead of the traditional evening dinner celebrating in the morning or early afternoon, eggs Benedict, smoked salmon, champagne, fresh fruits. It was more casual, less formal, accommodated modern lifestyles where extended families were geographically dispersed and couldn't commit to full days together. Tradition adapting to new realities, as it always has, but each adaptation generated debate about what was being lost. As the 20th century came to an end, the millennium approached with apocalyptic and utopian expectations simultaneously. The millennium bug, Y2K, threatened to collapse computer systems. Some stockpiled food for Christmas 1999 as if it were the last. It wasn't, of course, but it was clear that the new century would bring even faster changes. The internet was about to explode beyond any prediction. Social networks would emerge. And Christmas food, already so transformed, was about to enter the digital age where every dish would be photographed, shared, judged, gone viral. The relationship between food, identity, and public performance was about to become more complex than ever. We now enter the first decades of the 21st century, when digital technology profoundly transformed our relationship with food and celebrations. Imagine preparing a Christmas dinner in 2005 and having instant access to millions of recipes from every corner of the world through your computer. It was no longer necessary to depend on grandmother's recipe notebook or wait for the December edition of the cooking magazine. All of humanity's culinary knowledge was available in seconds. But did this abundance of information make us better cooks, or just more confused and anxious about our choices? Online cooking videos exploded in this era, completely democratizing access to techniques that were once professional secrets. Anyone with a camera could teach their special Christmas recipe to the entire world. Some of these recipes had millions of views, more people learning from a single video than decades of family oral transmission would reach. Home chefs became internet celebrities, building loyal audiences. It was wonderfully democratic, but also created a new form of pressure. Your culinary skills were constantly compared with talented professionals and amateurs from around the world. Food photography became a cultural phenomenon in its own right. Suddenly, it wasn't enough that food tasted good. It had to look visually spectacular. Dishes were composed thinking about how they would photograph. Contrasting colors, varied heights, strategically placed decorative elements. Some families developed the habit of photographing the complete Christmas table before anyone could eat, documenting every detail. Food had become not just sustenance or pleasure, but content, something to be captured, preserved digitally, shared. Did this enrich the experience by creating permanent visual memories, or distract us from the present moment? The search for viral recipes, those that spread rapidly online through sharing, created gastronomic trends that swept the world at surprising speed. An innovative cake format that emerged in South Korea could be replicated in American kitchens 2 weeks later. Japanese confectionery techniques influenced European bakers in real time. Christmas absorbed these trends, increasingly elaborate cookie decorations, mirror glaze techniques on cakes, theatrical presentations with dry ice smoke. Innovation was constant but also exhausting. There was always something new to try, always a more impressive technique to master. Cooking blogs multiplied by the thousands, housewives, retirees, young professionals, all sharing their versions of classic Christmas recipes or creating innovative fusions. But there was a growing problem. To find the recipe itself, you had to scroll through thousands of words of personal history, flowery descriptions, and advertisements. The origin of this recipe goes back to my great-grandmother who emigrated from Poland. 3,000 words later, finally, the ingredients. It was necessary for search algorithms but frustrating for those who just wanted to know how much sugar to use. The information was free, but the price was attention and patience. The digital era also brought food delivery apps, completely transforming access to prepared meals. In urban areas, you could order a complete Christmas dinner from local restaurants, delivered hot to your door. For people who worked long hours, cared for sick relatives, or simply didn't like cooking, this was liberating. But it also created a new class of workers. Delivery drivers peddling or driving in all weather conditions, often working on holidays so others could rest. The convenience of some depended on the invisible work of others. How many of us paused to think about this chain when we clicked order? The vegan and plant-based movement gained enormous strength in the 2000s and 2010s, driven by documentaries about health and the environment, plus growing awareness about animal welfare. For the first time in generations, serious conflicts arose at Christmas tables over what was morally acceptable to eat. Younger family members adopted diets that excluded traditional central dishes, the turkey, the ham. Families divided, prepare separate dishes to accommodate everyone, or insist that, in this house, we eat meat. These tensions revealed how food is never just food, its identity, values, worldview. Negotiating these differences required diplomacy and, sometimes, willingness to create new traditions. Awareness about food waste grew dramatically. Widely shared online studies showed shocking amounts of food thrown away, especially during celebrations when we systematically cooked too much. Zero waste movements encourage careful planning, realistic portions, and creativity with leftovers. Apps connected people to establishments selling surplus at discount. Composting became growing urban practice. But the tension remained. Visible abundance is part of the celebration, but also morally questionable in a world where millions go hungry. How do we balance symbolic generosity with practical responsibility? Artisanal and local food became simultaneously a genuine movement and a marketing strategy. Farmers' markets re-emerged in cities. People sought to connect with the origin of foods, to know who produced them. Our turkey is from a family farm 40 kilometers away, became a statement of values, and let's admit it, also of status. It was authentic desire for sustainability or virtue signaling. Probably both, in ways impossible to disentangle. Human motivations are rarely pure, but the results, supporting local agriculture, reducing carbon footprint, were positive, even if motivations were mixed. Technology entered the kitchen physically too. Internet-connected ovens you could control remotely, programmable slow cookers, meat thermometers with apps that alerted when the roast reached perfect temperature, digital scales connected to apps that guided recipes step by step. For some, these tools removed uncertainty and anxiety from cooking, making it more accessible. For others, they were expensive distractions from fundamental skills we should simply learn. But the direction was clear. The kitchen was increasingly being mediated by digital devices for better or worse. Meal kit subscription services emerged as an interesting phenomenon. Boxes delivered weekly with pre-portioned ingredients and recipes. Some offered Christmas dinner options, all ingredients measured exactly, eliminating planning and shopping. It was a middle ground between cooking completely from scratch and ordering ready-made. It reduced waste, exact portions, and decisions someone already planned for you. But at what cost? The skill of planning meals, evaluating ingredients, adapting recipes, all these competencies atrophied when outsourced. Were we becoming executors of instructions instead of creative cooks? The hack culture also defined this era. Videos showing shortcuts, tricks, and revolutionary ways to prepare food faster or easier. Some were genuinely useful, many were nonsense presented convincingly. Peel garlic in 10 seconds. Roast turkey in half the time. Transform leftovers into a gourmet dish. The content was optimized for clicks and shares, not necessarily for practical utility. But millions watched, tried, sometimes failed, spectacularly. The failures were also shared, creating their own genre of "I tried, and it went wrong" entertainment. Culinary globalization reached its apex. Ingredients from anywhere on the planet were available, if not locally, then online with fast delivery. Your Christmas dinner could include Ethiopian spices, Thai sauces, French cheeses, Chilean wines, all simultaneously. It was unprecedented wealth, but also loss of connection with seasonality and locality. You could have strawberries in December, squash in June. The natural rhythm of the seasons, which had governed human eating for millennia, became irrelevant. We gained convenience and variety, but lost the sense of place and time that came from eating what naturally grew around us at each season. Artificial intelligence began to appear timidly in cooking apps. Virtual assistants could read recipes aloud, convert measurements, suggest ingredient substitutions. Some apps used AI to analyze photos of your refrigerator and suggest recipes with what you had. Smart refrigerators theoretically tracked inventory and created shopping lists. In practice, the technology was still imperfect, often failing in frustratingly comical ways. But the trajectory was clear. Algorithms began to mediate even the most intimate and creative choices, like what to cook for our loved ones. And so, as we progressed through the digital era, Christmas continued its eternal dance between tradition and innovation. The tools changed dramatically, from open fireplace to gas stove, to electric, to microwave, to voice-controlled apps. But the fundamental need remained: to gather loved ones, share food, prepared with care, or, at least intention, create light and warmth and connection during the darkest and coldest time of year. Each generation finds new ways to express this ancient need. And as we look to the future, with its promises of lab-grown meat, 3D food printers, and who knows what other innovations, we could be sure that humans would continue adapting, complaining about the changes, but ultimately embracing new ways of doing what we've always done: celebrate together. We've arrived at a moment in history where, for the first time, the consequences of our food choices are impossible to ignore. The first decades of the 21st century brought growing awareness about climate change, environmental degradation, and the unsustainability of industrial food systems. Suddenly, the Christmas table, always a symbol of carefree abundance, became a place of complex ethical questions. Imagine yourself planning the 2023 dinner and considering, where did each ingredient come from? How much carbon was emitted to bring it here? Did animals suffer? Were workers exploited? These questions, which previous generations rarely asked, now weigh on many of us. But is it possible to celebrate consciously without losing the joy that makes celebration meaningful? Meat, historically, the center of any important celebration, became a controversial topic. Widely shared studies showed that beef production is one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, more than all cars, planes, and ships combined, according to some estimates. Raising a single kilogram of beef requires thousands of liters of water, vast expanses of land, and produces methane in alarming quantities. For people who internalize this information, putting roast on the Christmas table was no longer a neutral gesture. It was a statement. Some stopped eating meat completely, others reduced dramatically. Many continued, but with growing guilt or aggressive defense of their choices. Alternatives to traditional meat exploded in availability and sophistication. Vegetable burgers that bleed, pea protein sausages, chicken made from textured soy. Companies invested billions developing convincing substitutes. In some progressive families, Christmas 2020 featured turkey made entirely of plants. Structured, seasoned, even with fibrous texture imitating poultry meat. For some it was an exciting future, for others an abomination disrespecting sacred traditions. Discussions at the table could get heated. Is it just food, or is cultural identity being attacked? It depends on who you ask. But there was also movement in a different direction, better quality meat, in smaller quantities. Instead of industrial turkey raised in miserable conditions, choosing free-range bird, naturally fed, from a local farm. It cost much more, perhaps 3 or 4 times as much, but the argument was that it valued the animal, supported sustainable agriculture, and resulted in superior flavor. Less but better became a mantra. A small roast of excellent quality, complemented by abundance of seasonal vegetables instead of multiple mediocre meats. It was a return to pre-industrial practices where meat was an occasional luxury, not a daily expectation. Vegetables experienced a surprising renaissance. For centuries relegated to forgettable side dishes, chefs and home cooks began treating them as stars. Whole roasted cauliflower with spices until golden, served as a centerpiece. Mushrooms prepared until they developed deep umami flavor. Squashes stuffed with grains, nuts, and dried fruits, as substantial as any meat. Entire cookbooks dedicated to vegetables, techniques to extract maximum flavor, presentations rivaling any roast. Vegetarian Christmas was no longer sad deprivation. It could be a colorful and satisfying feast. The question of imported versus local ingredients became a moral dilemma. Those asparagus from Peru in December, strawberries from Chile, lamb from New Zealand all traveled thousands of kilometers, consuming fossil fuel just to reach your table. The environmental impact was undeniable. Locavorism movements encouraged eating only what grew within a certain radius, 100 miles, 50 miles. But this meant radically different Christmases depending on where you lived. In cold climates, local December meant roots, cabbages, stored squashes, delicious if prepared skillfully, but requiring creativity and renouncing expectations of infinite variety. Food waste received intense attention. Estimates suggested that 30–40% of all food produced was thrown away, rotting in fields, discarded by supermarkets, thrown away by consumers. At Christmas, when tradition mandated preparing much more than anyone could eat, waste was especially obscene. Activists and educators taught better planning, calculating portions realistically, storing correctly to preserve leftovers, creatively reusing. Turkey leftovers became pies, soups, sandwiches, wilting vegetables became broths. Old bread became bread pudding. Nothing needed to be wasted with a little knowledge and effort. Packaging also came into focus. Those plastic trays, plastic wrap, styrofoam boxes, every Christmas generated mountains of garbage that would go to landfills or, worse, oceans. Zero waste movements encouraged buying in bulk, using reusable packaging, choosing products with minimal or compostable packaging. Farmers' markets allowed bringing your own bags and containers. Some people took this to impressive extremes, producing literally zero trash. For most, it was an aspiration only partially achieved. We did the best we could, but systems weren't configured to facilitate sustainable choices. Water also emerged as a consideration. Certain crops, almonds, avocados, some vegetables, required enormous amounts of water, often in regions already facing scarcity. Almond milk, popular among vegans, had a surprisingly high water footprint. Nothing was simple. Every choice had hidden costs. Trying to optimize all variables, carbon, water, animal welfare, labor justice, nutrition, flavor, tradition, was paralyzing. Many people eventually chose one or two priorities and accepted that perfection was impossible. Doing something was better than doing nothing, even if it wasn't everything. The concept of regenerative food gained traction among the most engaged. Not just sustainable, maintaining the status quo, but regenerative, actively improving ecosystems. Agriculture that rebuilds soil, sequesters carbon, increases biodiversity. Rotational grazing of livestock that mimics natural patterns and enriches pastures. These were ancient practices being rediscovered and validated by modern science. Regeneratively produced foods could actually be more environmentally beneficial than some industrial plant agriculture dependent on pesticides and synthetic fertilizers. The narrative of meat always bad, plants always good proved too simplistic. The production method mattered as much as the product. Children growing up in this era absorbed these concerns from an early age. Schools taught about climate change, food life cycles, ecological impacts. 8-year-olds asked their parents why they were buying fruit in plastic packaging or where the chicken came from. Some became vegetarians before adolescence, motivated by compassion for animals or environmental awareness. This inverted traditional family dynamic, young people educating and sometimes judging their parents instead of the opposite. It created tension, but also hope. The next generation could do better. Fair trade and labor justice also entered the conversation. That coffee, chocolate, spices, tea, who harvested them and under what conditions? Children working on cocoa plantations? Rural workers without basic rights? Fair trade certifications promised that producers received fair payment and worked in safe conditions. Buying certified products cost more, but guaranteed that your celebration wasn't built on the exploitation of others. At least in theory, certifications were sometimes questioned for being weak or poorly enforced. Again, nothing was perfectly simple. Home and urban gardening resurged. People growing vegetable gardens in yards, balconies, even inside apartments with grow lights. Fresh herbs, tomatoes, peppers, lettuce. Small contributions to the Christmas table, but cultivated with your own hands, without transport footprint. There was deep satisfaction in serving something you planted, cared for, harvested. It reconnected people with natural cycles of growth, with the patience plants require, with gratitude for food we often take for granted. It was practical, but also spiritual, repairing the fracture between humans and the natural systems that sustain us. Technology also offered solutions. Apps tracked the carbon footprint of different foods, helping make informed choices. Maps showed local farms and markets. Platforms connected consumers directly to producers, eliminating intermediaries and reducing costs and waste. Smart sensors monitored food in refrigerators, alerting before spoilage. They weren't panaceas. Technology alone wouldn't solve systemic problems, but they were useful tools for those trying to do better. There was also growing recognition that obsession with individual perfect choices was insufficient and sometimes counterproductive. Real change required political and systemic action, regulations on industrial agriculture, redirected subsidies from monocultures to diversification, investment in local food infrastructure, labor laws protecting farm workers. Your choice of organic turkey was good, but voting and activism mattered more. Christmas could be a moment not just of conscious consumption, but of reflection on what kind of food systems we wanted to build for future generations. And so Christmas, in the 21st century, was becoming more complex, more conscious, more laden with ethical considerations. The lost innocence of simply cooking and eating without thinking would never return, at least not for those who had awakened to these questions. But perhaps that wasn't entirely negative. Eating consciously, recognizing the connections between our plates and broader ecological and social systems could deepen gratitude and meaning. Christmas was always about gratitude, after all, for abundance, for family, for survival through one more year. Expanding that gratitude to include the ecosystems that sustain us, the workers who cultivate our food, and the planet we all share, perhaps that was the natural and necessary evolution of the celebration. And as we look to the future, uncertain as always, we could at least try to ensure there would be a future to celebrate. We are now at the frontiers of the present, looking at emerging innovations that promise to radically transform what we eat in the coming years and decades. Some of these technologies are already here, in early stages. Others still live in research laboratories, but all carry the potential to change our relationship with food as profoundly as agriculture changed 10,000 years ago, or as industrialization changed 200 years ago. Imagine a Christmas 20 years from now, meat grown in laboratories without animal slaughter, desserts printed in 3 dimensions with millimeter precision, personalized ingredients based on your individual DNA. It sounds like science fiction, but much of this technology already exists in primitive forms. The question isn't whether it will come, but when and how we choose to use it. Cultivated meat, also called clean meat or cellular meat, is perhaps the most controversial and transformative innovation. Scientists harvest cells from living animals without killing them and cultivate them in bioreactors, feeding them nutrients until they form real muscle, fat, connective tissue. The result is meat genetically identical to conventional meat, but without needing to raise and slaughter billions of animals. In 2020, Singapore approved the first commercial sale of cultivated chicken. The cost is still prohibitive, thousands of dollars per kilogram, but it's dropping exponentially. Projections suggest that within 10 to 15 years, cultivated meat could compete in price with conventional meat. Imagine a Christmas turkey, indistinguishable from traditional in taste and texture, but produced without animal suffering and with a fraction of the environmental footprint. Would you serve it? Or would the absence of a real animal make the celebration less authentic? 3D food printers already exist, although they're still rudimentary and expensive. They work by depositing layers of edible pastes, vegetable purees, proteins, carbohydrates, in digitally programmed patterns. They can create structures impossible to make by hand, intricate edible sculptures, geometrically precise decorations, even personalized meals with nutrients adjusted for individual needs. Pastry chefs already use printers for incredibly detailed chocolate decorations. In coming years, we could print entire Christmas desserts, cakes with perfectly uniform layers, cookies with designs impossible to replicate manually. Would it be elevated art or loss of the humanity and imperfection that make homemade food special? Vertical and hydroponic agriculture is transforming where and how we grow food. Instead of vast horizontal fields, vertical farms stack crops on shelves lit by LEDs inside urban warehouses. They use 95% less water than traditional agriculture, no pesticides, and can produce harvests year-round, regardless of climate. Lettuces, herbs, strawberries are already grown commercially this way. Tomatoes, peppers, even potatoes are being tested. Imagine a city where each neighborhood has a vertical farm producing fresh vegetables for Christmas, harvested in the morning and served in the afternoon, without transport, without emissions. The food would be fresher than anything available in human history, except perhaps for those who grew their own gardens. Artificial intelligence is entering the kitchen in increasingly sophisticated ways. Algorithms can already analyze thousands of recipes and suggest flavor combinations humans have never tried, but that work based on molecular compatibilities. They can create personalized recipes based on your preferences, dietary restrictions, available ingredients, and even your current health status. An app could scan your refrigerator, consider that you have high cholesterol and a dairy allergy, and suggest a complete Christmas dinner perfectly adapted. Prototypes of robot chefs already exist, mechanical arms that can follow recipes, stir pots, even season with precision. A robot chef in your home kitchen is still years away from being accessible, but it's no longer pure fiction. Smart sensors and labels promise to eliminate food waste from spoilage. Packaging with chemical sensors that change color when food starts to spoil. Much more accurate than arbitrary expiration dates. Refrigerators that automatically track what you have, alert you about expiring items, and suggest recipes to use them. Restaurants and supermarkets using AI to predict demand and adjust production, drastically reducing how much they throw away. If implemented widely, we could reduce global food waste by 50% or more. Massive savings of resources and relief for systems under pressure. Genetic editing of crops through tools like CRISPR allows modifying plants with surgical precision, much more refined than old genetic engineering. Researchers have already created tomatoes with much higher levels of beneficial antioxidants, disease-resistant wheat without need for pesticides, rice that grows in salt water. In the future, we could have nutritionally optimized Christmas vegetables, potatoes with complete protein, cabbages with vitamin D, fruits without blood sugar spiking sugars, but maintaining sweetness. But this raises questions. Are we improving nature or arrogantly interfering in systems we don't fully understand? The answers aren't simple. Precision fermentation is a technique where microbes, yeasts, bacteria are genetically programmed to produce specific molecules. It's already used to make insulin and other medicines. Now it's being applied to food. Companies produce milk proteins without cows, egg whites without chickens, specific fats without animals, or plantations. These proteins are molecularly identical to natural ones. Cheese made from precision fermentation proteins has the same taste, texture, and melting properties as dairy cheese, but without cows. At a future Christmas, your gratin could use this cheese, indistinguishable from traditional, but produced in a radically different way. Augmented and virtual reality also begins to affect how we experience food. AR apps can overlay recipes and instructions over your vision while cooking, guiding each step. They could show how the dish should look at each stage, making it easier to follow complex recipes. There's even research on using virtual reality to modify taste perception. Images and sounds can make unsalted food taste saltier, or vegetables taste sweeter. It sounds absurd, but it could help people eat more healthily without feeling deprived. Imagine a Christmas where special glasses make your healthy meal look and taste like an indulgent feast. Edible insects, crickets, grasshoppers, beetle larvae, are slowly gaining acceptance in the West, where they were historically rejected with disgust. They're consumed by billions of people in Africa, Asia, Latin America for millennia. Nutritionally, they're excellent. High protein content, healthy fats, vitamins, minerals. Environmentally, they're incredibly efficient. They convert feed to protein much better than livestock, require minimal water and space, produce almost no greenhouse gas emissions. Companies already sell cricket flour for baking, protein bars with insects, even whole seasoned insects as snacks. Will cricket flour Christmas cookies be common 20 years from now? The idea still seems repulsive to many, but tastes change. Remember that sushi seemed repugnant to Westerners just 40 years ago. Personalized nutrition based on genetics is emerging. Accessible DNA tests can reveal how your body processes different nutrients. Some people metabolize caffeine quickly, others slowly. Some need more vitamin D, others less. Certain genes affect how you respond to saturated fats or carbohydrates. Companies already offer personalized meal plans based on genetics. In the future, your Christmas dinner could be optimized for your unique genetic profile. Portions and ingredients calibrated to maximize your health and energy. Would this be wonderful personalized care or destroy the communal nature of shared meals where everyone eats the same? Blockchain and digital traceability promise complete transparency about food origins. Scan a QR code on your Christmas turkey and see exactly which farm raised it, what it was fed, how it lived, who processed it, every step of the supply chain. This allows verifying claims of organic, humane, sustainable, eliminating fraud and greenwashing. For consumers who care about ethics, it's empowering, but it also raises privacy questions and whether we really want to know all the details or if some ignorance is comfortable. Synthetic flavors are becoming incredibly sophisticated. Food chemists can create molecules that perfectly imitate natural flavors or even create completely new flavors that don't exist in nature. We already have synthetic vanilla indistinguishable from natural. They're developing plant-based meats where every flavor molecule is synthesized to exactly match the chemical profile of real meat. In the future, we could have Christmas desserts with impossible flavors, combinations that activate taste buds in ways no natural food does. Would it be exciting culinary innovation or crossing boundaries that should be respected? The rescue and preservation of ancestral crop varieties, called heritage or heirloom, also represents a different kind of future. Thousands of varieties of apples, potatoes, tomatoes, grains that existed 100 years ago have disappeared, replaced by industrial monocultures optimized for yield and transport, not flavor. Farmers and enthusiasts are saving rare seeds, growing old varieties, rediscovering lost flavors. Some of these heirloom crops are surprisingly superior in taste. Tomatoes that actually taste like tomatoes should, potatoes with distinct textures and flavors. A future Christmas could celebrate not just technological innovation, but also recovery of lost diversity, honoring varieties our great-grandparents knew, but that disappeared. Local and decentralized food production may be the future as much as futuristic technologies. Instead of massive industrial farms, networks of small local producers using regenerative and agroecological techniques. Instead of giant supermarkets, cooperative markets and direct producer-consumer delivery systems. Technology can facilitate this. Apps connecting people to local farms, logistics optimized by AI. But the philosophy is ancient, eating close to home, knowing who produces your food, being connected with land and seasons. The future Christmas could be high-tech and traditional simultaneously, using modern tools to enable ancient practices. And so, as we look to the future, we see diverging possibilities. One path leads to increasingly technological, synthetic, optimized food, perhaps eventually divorced from agriculture as we know it. Another path seeks return to ancient, regenerative, local practices, mediated by technology but fundamentally connected to the land. The real future will probably be a mixture of both. People making different choices based on values, circumstances, and access. What we eat at Christmas in 2045 or 2060 may be radically different from today, but the essential function will remain: gathering loved ones, sharing abundance, creating light and warmth and memory amid the dark winter. The tools and ingredients change, but the fundamental human need remains constant across all eras. And as we navigate these dizzying transformations, perhaps wisdom lies in maintaining balance, embracing useful innovation, but not losing connection with land, community, and traditions that ground us and give us meaning. We've traveled an extraordinary journey through more than 2,000 years of history, from the Roman banquets of Saturnalia to the futuristic promises of laboratory-grown meat and food printers. We've seen empires rise and fall, technologies completely transform how we produce and prepare food, ingredients travel the world and become traditions in distant lands. But now, at the end of this long journey through the centuries, it's worth pausing and asking a simple but profound question: what really matters? When we remove all the layers of technological novelty, all the fleeting food fads, all the debates about sustainability and ethics, what remains at the heart of the Christmas celebration that has crossed millennia and will continue crossing centuries to come? The answer, perhaps surprisingly, is remarkably simple: human connection. In every era we visited, regardless of what was on the table, the true meaning lay in who gathered around it. Wealthy Romans with their extravagant banquets and poor Romans with their modest meals shared the same need: to be together, to mark the winter solstice with human presence that pushed back the literal and metaphorical darkness. Medieval peasants sharing a modest goose created memories as meaningful as nobles with their elaborate wild boars. Families during the world wars, eating substitutes and rations, maintained rituals because the ritual itself, the act of gathering, of trying to create normalcy and celebration amid chaos, was what really sustained them. Notice how, in every era, people lamented that true traditions were being lost. Victorians mourned that industrialization was destroying authentic customs. Generations of the 1960s thought frozen food was ruining Christmas. Today we worry about screens, deliveries, digital disconnection, but this anxiety about losing authenticity is itself a tradition. Each generation feels it's at the inflection point where something essential is disappearing, and each generation is partially right. Something is always changing, always has been, always will be. But the core persists because the human need that feeds it persists. Food is the medium, never the end. This may seem heretical in a video entirely about Christmas food through history, but it's fundamentally true. The turkey, or the goose, or the tofu, or the cultivated meat, they are vehicles for something greater. They are the excuse that gives us permission to pause busy lives, travel distances, make the effort to gather. They are the shared project that gives families something to do together. Cooking side by side, each person contributing a dish, transmitting recipes and techniques from generation to generation. They are generosity materialized, the time, effort, and resources invested in preparing food for people we love. We could technically obtain nutrition more efficiently in other ways, but it's not about efficiency. It never was. Imperfection is part of the value. That pudding that collapsed, the roast that was too dry, the burned cookies, these failures often generate the best stories and memories. Laughing together at culinary disasters creates deeper connection than effortless perfection. Recipes passed through generations are rarely written perfectly. A handful of this, bake until it looks done, like grandmother made it. That frustrating imprecision is exactly what forces in-person transmission, mentorship, connection. If everything were perfectly replicable by algorithm, we'd lose the human aspect that makes it valuable. And here we arrive at a central tension of our current moment. We have more access, more knowledge, more options, more technology than any generation in history. We can order any ingredient, access any recipe, watch detailed videos of any technique. We could, in theory, create spectacular Christmas dinners with relative ease. But many of us feel more anxious, more inadequate, more overwhelmed than previous generations who had a fraction of the resources. Why? Because abundance of choice paralyzes. Because constant comparison with impossible standards undermines confidence. Because we confuse having access to tools with an obligation to use them perfectly. The wisdom perhaps lies in consciously choosing what to adopt and what to let go. Not every innovation needs to be embraced. Not every tradition needs to be maintained. You can use a recipe app but reject the obsession with photographing everything. You can choose sustainable ingredients but not torture yourself over imperfections. You can keep your great-grandmother's recipe exactly as it was or adapt it radically, and both choices are valid if made with intention. The problem is never change itself. It's thoughtless change, made because everyone is doing it, because an algorithm suggested it, because an influencer recommended it, without pausing to ask, does this serve me and the people I love? Stories matter as much as food. Every dish on your Christmas table has a story. Not just the recipe, but where the ingredients came from, who grew them, how they reached you. It has personal history, who taught you to make it, memories associated with it, why you chose to include it. Telling these stories while eating, especially to children, weaves texture of meaning around the meal. Your great-grandfather loved this dish. I learned this when I lived in. This recipe is from a country I've never visited, but these narratives transform food from fuel into culture, from consumption into communion. Gratitude, practiced genuinely, changes everything. Not performative or obligatory gratitude, but the act of really pausing and recognizing the extraordinary chain of events, work, and luck that brought food to your table. Farmers waking before dawn, truck drivers driving through the night, supermarket workers stocking shelves, the land itself producing generously, generations of accumulated knowledge about how to transform raw ingredients into something delicious. When you really consider this, the miraculous complexity of systems that allow you to simply go to a store and buy ingredients from half the world, it becomes harder to take for granted. And from that gratitude flows naturally the will to waste less, value more, share generously. The future will be what we make of it. The trends we discussed, cultivated meat, AI in the kitchen, vertical agriculture, are not inevitable destiny, but possibilities. Collectively, through billions of individual choices and political decisions, we shape which technologies flourish and which wither. If we value human connection over convenience, that will be reflected. If we prioritize sustainability over immediate cost, systems will adapt. If we insist on maintaining space for imperfection, creativity, and discovery instead of algorithmic optimization of every aspect of life, we can preserve that. We are not passive passengers of technological progress. We are active participants in its direction. Perhaps the most important lesson from the last pages of history is this: humans are incredibly adaptable and resilient. We celebrated Christmas through plagues and wars, through famine and abundance, through technological changes that completely transformed societies. We absorbed new ingredients from newly discovered continents and made them tradition. We adapted ancient recipes to new realities. We found ways to maintain meaning even when external forms changed radically. This adaptability is not betrayal of tradition. It is the very essence of tradition, which has always been a living and evolving process, never a dead and frozen artifact. And here's something beautiful. No matter how different your Christmas table is from your grandparents or from someone on the other side of the world, you share something fundamental. That family in Japan eating fried chicken from the store, that family in Brazil with their farofa and tender, that vegan family in Portland with chickpea roast, that family in London maintaining traditional pudding, that elderly person eating alone a simple but carefully prepared meal. All are participating in the same ancient human impulse. They are marking time, honoring connections, creating light amid darkness. The manifestations vary infinitely, but the meaning is universal. So, as you plan your next Christmas, consider, what do you want it to mean? Not what advertising says it should be, not what you see in perfectly edited videos online, not what tradition insists it must be. What do you, specifically, surrounded by the specific people you love, at this specific moment in history, want to create? Perhaps it's elaborate and ambitious. Perhaps it's simple and peaceful. Perhaps it's a mixture of 3 different cultures. Perhaps it's exactly as it's always been. All these choices are valid if they're intentional, if they serve connection and joy, if they create memories worth keeping. And remember, the food you serve, no matter how modest, is connected to all this history we've traveled together. When you roast potatoes, you're using an ingredient that traveled from the Andes and took centuries to be accepted. When you use spices, you're participating in trade that once motivated explorations and empires. When you gather people around a shared table, you're practicing a ritual older than agriculture, more fundamental than civilization. You are a link in an unbroken chain that extends tens of thousands of years into the past and will continue indefinitely into the future. This is not poetic exaggeration, it's literally true. Christmas, in the end, is about hope. It always has been. To celebrate amid the darkest winter, affirming that light will return. To gather in difficult times, affirming that connection persists. To prepare an abundant table, affirming that there will be next year to celebrate. To maintain traditions, affirming that what came before matters. To adapt and innovate, affirming that the future can be better. These are not contradictions. They are complementary aspects of the same fundamental hope. And as long as there are humans, there will be this need to pause, gather, share, and affirm together. We are here, we survived one more year, and this is worth celebrating. Thank you for accompanying us on this journey through the centuries of flavors, stories, and Christmas traditions. If this journey resonated with you, if it awakened curiosity about your own family traditions, if it made you see your Christmas table with new eyes, we would love for you to join the Sleeping Times community. Subscribe to the channel to explore more historical journeys like this one, where we dive deep into fascinating aspects of the past that shaped our present. We are more than a channel. We are a community of curious people who value learning while relaxing, who find comfort in understanding where we come from. Every video is a door to another time, another place, another perspective. And you? You're part of this journey with us now. Leave in the comments, what story from your family about Christmas food do you value most? What tradition do you maintain? And which have you created anew? Let's continue this conversation together. Welcome to Sleeping Times, where history meets rest and curiosity meets community. Sleep well and dream of all the Christmases that were and that are yet to come.